on the
I was at seminary. For my senior sermon, my grandfather happened to be visiting, and so the like stars aligned, and he was there for this, pinnacle experience as a senior, preaching in front of your peers and your teacher.
Yep.
He was an old Southern Baptist deacon, and so the whole service, he was like, "Amen, preach, brother," and all of my classmates hated me for the rest. Like, did you just bring your grandpa, like, just to make it sound like you were really crushing it? Like, I can't help the deacon, like the deacon will deacon.
Yeah.
So, all right. Do you need PowerPoint or anything?
I don't.
Do you need a lectern?
No.
Because we have one. No, God, it was up to you.
No, not at all.
Um,
You have any Bibles at all? I brought a handout with. Oh, perfect.
I will.
That's the only.
I've got this, Jared.
You do? All right. So I'll scoot this in because you don't need to stand in the way of all that.
Perfect.
Great.
All right.
And then, and are those handouts?
And this is actually just biblical text.
Okay, cool.
A few questions. So,
So, yeah, I'm one of the people in the room can help you pass them out when you're
Yeah.
ready. So,
Perfect.
all right.
Right.
And we've got your ACH, so that either has come or will come to you
Yeah,
sometime
that
soon.
is-
So,
all right.
yeah.
Sounds good.
Thank you again for doing it.
Yeah, of course.
When Mark
Anytime.
said that you were coming, I looked up
Yeah.
and saw your CV and was like, wow, we're very lucky to have you with us.
Yeah. No, it's the Princeton connection here too with
Nate
Judy
Millay
Stack,
and
yeah.
Judy Stack
That's
and
the whole crew.
Eric Barreto. Do you know Eric?
Yeah.
Eric is a family friend, kind of dear friend of ours.
Nice.
He and his wife Holly.
Nice.
We when they were robbed by Princeton from us, taken away.
Yes.
We lost our like family. So
I know.
we every time we're out east, we try to fly in and out of Philadelphia or New York so we can spend a day with them.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to see that the Princeton connection keeps on giving here.
Keeps on giving. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, in a moment, they'll begin 9:45 is when we try to let
Yep,
out, but
yep.
if they're by 10 is, at the latest, they'll start letting you know.
Like my students.
Yeah,
They're ruffling their,
like just sort of hankering for more coffee, rattling keys, those sort of things.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Would you stand in and give a brief prayer?
That would be perfect. Thank you, Chris. All right.
All right.
Dan,
Have a good,
no,
have a
back.
good meeting.
Give me a 3 cents introduction. Dan, last name.
Yask.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yaski.
You're
I
a
am-
friend of mine, of Mark's.
Yeah, you guys. So I teach at St. Thomas.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, you teach at the same time?
I do. and I'm from Chelan, Minnesota originally.
Okay, Minnesota.
Yep, from a farm. However, I lived in Georgia for 10 years before coming
What,
here.
Joe?
Yeah.
That's why I'm like you.
Yeah. And so
Did you
came
go to
here.
Emory?
No, I taught at a university down in Georgia for Georgia Southern University. It's lived in Savannah and I traveled there. So yeah, got a lot of
So Dan Bianchi, St. Thomas University, where the bar, Methodist,
coming from Georgia.
coming from Georgia.
Yeah.
Okay, are you faculty at St. Thomas?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is my third year. at
And
St.
what
Thomas.
is your particular?
Yeah, theology, like about.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
wonderful. We're excited to have you.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy for the fire because I'm still trying to get used to the weather.
Yes, indeed. Giving Bibles to everyone today. Mhm. Good morning. Excuse me, Sally. What? I called you Sarah. I got the first one. You called me Sarah? I called you Sue. Sue, oh, that's, if we're thinking the same thing, Sue, that's an honor. We're thinking of say Sue. All right, good answer.
Although Sally Sue has a nice ring.
Sally Sue is definitely. Seven.
Sally Susanna.
Sally Suzanne. Yeah.
That's right.
I'm so proud of my house. Oh, really? Yes. Well, you brought the sunshine with you. I hope so. I wasn't thinking of this suit, but this is gonna be number two. There's five of these. So how are you, Lana?
Good. You
Fine, thank you. All right,
got the bases
we
covered.
got the bases covered, right? I'm thinking about my next one. Does anyone know how things did?
Person was there, I was there, it
It was glorious.
Wonderful. How many people came?
was about 37.
That's
Wow.
outstanding.
Say 40, yeah.
And how many had RSVP?
2. No, I think she said a few people that RSV didn't show and a few people that had
Yeah.
showed. Had not showed, so
But
it
she
worked out.
estimated the head count, but it was truly wonderful. It was truly, would you agree?
Yeah.
Is there a mix of parishioners and people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
It was great. And I'm very excited. I want to be. Liz, the only thing Otto and I were talking about is Liz did too much work.
Yeah.
She cooked all the turkeys.
Wow.
What would
That's why-
Liz say if she were here?
She would say it was wonderful, but we all agreed we're going to help out more next year.
Okay, and she accepted that.
Well, it doesn't matter. We're helping out more
I
next year. There, by the way, Jan, there are Bibles here that, yes, yes, the Bible.
Church.
I know, it's a church thing, I know. Is it
Uh,
Dan Piaski?
Dan Piasky, you
Okay.
got it, yeah.
So
And-
we're.
It is the hour, if everyone will make sure you have a Bible. And, if you'll grab your Bible right here, it's the Bible hour, girls and boys. So excited to introduce our guest today.
Yeah.
Dan Piaski is a friend of our own Mark McElroy. He is, and Sally, would you direct folks to?
I will.
Thank you, sir. He is on the faculty, a Bible scholar at St. Thomas University. He is coming to us most immediately from the sunny south, my neck of the woods, Georgia. And Georgia Southern, he's acclimating to the nippy day that we're having. And we're so glad to be together. I will open with the prayer. The Lord be with me.
And also.
Oh Lord, we give you thanks for this day, for this portion of good health. For the light, for this presentation, may you guide us in discernment as we listen to our guests. Amen.
All right, thank you so much, and Sally? Is that correct?
I'm Chris.
Yes.
Here's
Yeah,
Sally.
it is Sally,
And
all right, very good. Chris, where are you from originally?
Florida Cracker.
Oh, wow. Panhandle?
Fourth generation, what's it?
Panhandle?
No, but right in the right in the
Gainesville?
the center of the state.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
All
the
right.
place where people lived before concrete.
Yeah, nice, okay, not too far from Georgia then. Well, good morning, everyone, I'm Dan. I teach at St. Thomas with Dr. McEnroy, Mark, who I'm sure you all know. And I was classmates with folks who used to be here and now moved out to Princeton, and that's Elaine James and Nate Van Hypern. I don't know if you all remember them at all. And so many connections to this church in various ways. And actually last spring, Mark McEnroy reached out to me as they were planning this series in lieu of the election and things coming up. And so I think I'm the first in the series. I'm not sure if that's right. I might be one of the first at least. And so looking ahead to post-election United States and thinking through how some of the biblical writers and later on thought about divisions within the church, within the community, how to handle difference, so on and so forth. And so that's kind of my aim for today. I'm a Bible prof and I really do ancient history. So I do archaeology. I worked in Israel and Turkey. I do ancient languages. So I used to be in New York City. I taught ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew. So I'm situated probably in the deepest past of the speakers you will likely have. In fact, I do most of my work on Jerusalem around the year 1000 BC, which is kind of King David's stuff. And so I'm way back when it comes to my own research. But today I kind of want to historicize, situate the early Christian community in history and think through some of the concerns they had. And so I have a handout here, and that handout are just snippets of the book of Acts, in which I think we see some some interesting kind of issues arise. In the back, I have just 4 questions, and so eventually perhaps we can get to those here in time, or even have a little time for you all to think about those questions and come back to them. To begin though, actually, if you have a Bible, I want to look at the Gospel of John in chapter 17. If you all, let me find the page here, in the New Testament. John 17, roughly page like 111 in your Bible. And I want to begin here at verse 20, chapter 17. And I point out this text because I think it's an interesting insight into what this early, and by that I mean first century, early Jesus movement. There's not really even a church at this point in time in history, but you can feel this community starting to come together. Gospel of John typically is dated to around the year 90 or 100, so we are probably in 2nd or 3rd generation early Christian community. And so these are folks who probably did not know Jesus, but are the descendants of those who did, right? So the Gospel of John typically is thought of as the last gospel written down in terms of the New Testament. And in the second half of the Gospel of John, it's interesting because it doesn't have parallels with the other Gospels. So this material in the Gospel of John is unique to this Gospel, and that's always interesting because it tells us what are some of the concerns of this Gospel writer in contrast to other Gospel writers. And if you know the Gospel of John, Jesus gives an extended discussion here. It begins in chapter 13 where Jesus washes his disciples' feet, which we call Maundy Thursday in the Christian tradition. And then from that movement, Jesus continues on in this very lengthy 4-chapter speech about what's going to happen next and his explanation of that. And again, that's unique to the Gospel of John. You won't find that in the other Gospels. And then in chapter 17, Jesus offers this prayer, which is also interesting in terms of the context. In other words, I think the Gospel of John, who wrote this, wants you to understand that this prayer is for you as well. In other words, Jesus is praying into the future, if you will, right? From Jesus' own context into these future communities. And here, beginning in verse 20, this is Jesus now praying. I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I've given them, so that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. So there's one word that appears there repeatedly in that prayer, and that's the number 1. And this gives rise to all sorts of questions. Why is Jesus praying this particular prayer? And why is John the only gospel that records this prayer? And most historians will tell you that what we find with the Johannine corpus, by which I mean the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, even the book of Revelation, which are all kind of part of this community, that this is a community in crisis. And this is a community that is about ready to fracture and to be torn apart. And you can actually feel this in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John as well, where 3rd John is kind of like the cover letter to 2nd John, and 1st John is kind of the heart of that, which is all about love. It's a very famous text. 1st John is all about God is love, and Yolad is love language. And there too, the reason for that is because of a lack of love going on in that community, if you will, right? So if you read between the lines, part of the reason that Jesus is praying this prayer in the Gospel of John is because this Johannine community is not one, which is why Jesus is praying that they may be one. And historically, this offers some insights into what this community seems to be going through. Namely, again, divisions being torn apart, and I think real problems on the horizon. And if you can get into the Gospel of John, and there's a lot of difficulties in understanding who Jesus is and how we should understand Jesus and what's the correct understanding of Jesus' life, that I think are tearing community apart. So I think it's a theological issue. But it's also a sociological, historical issue in terms of how do we keep this community together now that the founder of that community has now been dead for 60 years perhaps? And what happens when the early Christian community recognizes that when is Jesus coming back is an open question, but certainly Jesus is not coming back within the first generation. In other words, the gospels start to get written down once the eyewitnesses of Jesus have died. Now there's a real pressure to say, oh, well, I can't go up to people and ask about Jesus because the eyewitnesses are dying off. And so now I need to write this stuff down. Gospel of Mark, Matthew can feel this. And now John's a generation to move further. And how do we keep this moving together? I raise these issues because I think Acts as well, which I have my hand out here for y'all, is also asking these sorts of questions. Which is to say, the problem, if you will, the challenge of trying to keep this Christian community together is amnesia. And some of the issues we face today in the 21st century, in terms of divergences in the Christian community that I think are pretty blatant, are not just our own, but actually reach back all the way into antiquity. In other words, I suppose what I'm trying to push back on is this idea that once upon a time, the Christian community was cohesive and everybody got along. And then through the centuries, the church sort of dissolved into what we have today. Whereas I think the reality is it's sort of always been within the Christian church, right? And Jesus's prayer here is just really striking for the fact that Jesus is just really trying to pray into the future that this community can somehow hold together, probably against great odds. And of course, there's persecutions going on as well with the Israeli community, which are referred to as well. So it's not just theological disagreements, there's actually persecutions that are starting to happen with Domitian in the 90s. And so there's real oppression that is tearing it apart. And so there's something in the DNA of the Christian story where these divisions, I think, are always sort of in the water, if you will. So I want to highlight that first. Any questions on that? It's a lot, kind of a large introduction, but I want to highlight that. I think I make a pretty good case that already in first century Christianity, we have divergent understandings of Jesus, divergent understandings of what it means to be Christian, divergent understandings of what this community is supposed to be, if you will. Yeah, please.
It's not so surprising. I mean, you
Right.
think about the imperfect humans that follow this movement.
Yeah.
With their own sort of ideas and interpretations. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And of course, you can even go back to something sort of about the disciples too, and their different perceptions of Jesus and how that gets played out. Okay, so that's my initial foray, please.
Well, and so are you also including in the Jonian Gospel, the Jonian letters 1, 2, and 3, also Revelations?
I think Revelation is also, at the very least, attesting to the pressures on this community. And that some of the ideas that are going on in Revelation are certainly in reaction to the persecution.
But basically coming from the same community of
Right.
writers.
Yeah, Revelation is also crisis literature, I think. I think the Gospel of John is crisis literature. I think First and Second, Third John they're all kind of manifestations of this crisis that are happening. And this is not about Revelation, because that's a whole box of worms, right? But I think to read Revelation well, you have to understand this crisis literature too, right? And situate that and see what that is going through. So yes, so I want to point this out. Turning to Acts, which is on my handout, I just have 4 little stories there. There too, I want to point out that Acts is coupled in the Bible with the Gospel of Luke, as you may or may not know. The opening to Luke in chapter 1, the opening to Acts chapter 1, both refer to an individual who Luke is writing to. Luke said at the outset, hey, you're in Acts. This is part 2 of my story. So we know these were once bound together as a single story that were only divided up later on by the church with the Gospel of John introduced in between them. Luke 2, I think, is trying to grapple with this question of what is the church and how do we think about addressing the divisions within it, if you will. One of the really good examples of this is you can compare the book of Acts and how it talks about Paul with Paul's own letters. And Paul is great because Paul gives you autobiographical snippets of what Paul thinks. Paul is very happy to tell you exactly what he thinks, including when he's very angry at people. And you can really compare Galatians with Acts too, where Paul tells his own story for a few verses. And the story Paul tells is somewhat different than Acts. Where the story that Paul tells is a little more gritty and one of some difficulties. Folks come in to churches in Galatia after Paul founds them and essentially tell those churches that Paul's a little bit crazy and they should not be listening to Paul and that they should listen to these new missionaries instead, because we all know Paul used to persecute the church. He has these ideas on what it means to be Christian that are at odds with the Jewish Christian community and so on and so forth. And now Paul writes this letter back in a pretty angry way, telling the story. But there too, you feel the tension in Paul's letters that Luke does not provide. Where Luke, the story of the church is going to be one in which Luke wants to provide a story in which the church is able to make it through these problems. And Luke wants to make you hopeful for the future in ways that I think Paul was still wrestling with. And when we say Acts, it's probably 20 years after Paul wrote his letter. So Acts is a newer text compared to Galatians, which is really maybe around year 50 or so. And so I think Acts is really interesting to see Luke grappling with these problems too. Again, of like, how do we keep this community together? And so I have just 4 stories where I think we see issues of difference arising in these stories already with the Pentecost story. And so if you have a handout, I'm just gonna grab one here. So I have a handout. The first story here is the Pentecost story. And on the back, I just have 4 questions that pertain to each of these. And so the first question is a question about the gift of languages that occurs here in the Pentecost story, which I'll read here in a second. And what do these languages suggest about identity and difference? And so hold that question in mind as I read through those snippet very quickly. Okay, so here's Acts chapter 2. Pentecost is essentially the birth of the church in terms of how Luke thinks about this. So the way when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as a fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every people under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at the sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, are not these all of these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and other parts of Libya according to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own language, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, what does this mean? But others sneered and said they are filled with new wine. So, what do we make of this story in terms of how the Spirit operates?
Well, your question says, what do you notice about what do the languages suggest about identity and difference?
Yeah.
I frankly don't know where Parthia or where.
Yeah.
And I.
Yeah, where are these places?
Yeah, if we had a sense and could
Yeah.
see them in the map,
Yeah,
that might,
this would help. I can answer that question in part. So Parthia is ancient Persia, which is to say modern day Iran, right, for example. And essentially, if you look at these locations, it represents what is almost the entire Roman Empire. At least from Rome and Italy, modern day Italy, to North Africa, eastward all the way to Iran. So I guess if you have a mental map in your head, it's a large area. And really Acts is centered on this area. There's not actually stories westward, although Paul has an idea of this, right? So really it's representing the world, if you will, to the audience of Acts. That's a good question. Yes, please.
It's just interesting the ways in which these differences are both one, they're all speaking about God.
Yep.
But it's chaotic and disruptive. Clearly, they're filled with new wine.
Yeah.
And
So I take away from it a sense that maybe not to be so afraid of divisions, but to think about how there might be a unity beneath it.
Yeah.
That might be a superficial reading, but,
No, I like that.
it seems that might be a possibility.
Yeah, yeah, because you're right, they are talking about the same thing, right? Which I think is, and I like the idea of the chaotic scene, 'cause I think that would have been correct. Yeah, that's nice. I don't think that's superficial. Other thoughts on the language bit?
Well, one thing that just occurred to me
Yeah.
is all the people that are in this crowd, they're bilingual.
Yeah.
Right? You don't go to Jerusalem, with a phrase book. You go there because you know the language that's going to be spoken, and you're going because Pentecost is a Jewish festival.
Yeah.
And so they're there for the Jewish festival, but if you're learning a second language, it's kind of like you have that dual vocabulary.
Yeah.
Right, and so you know what the word means in English, but you also know what it means in, say, Spanish.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, they're there and they're hearing them speak. They're speaking in Aramaic or Greek or whatever,
Yeah.
but you're hearing it translated in your own brain is what's going on.
Yeah, right. So I like the fact that, I think this is true. Presumably these travelers have come and, Aramaic would have probably been the lingua franca at this point in time, but one can imagine Greek, you're right, also being spoken. And yet they retain, of course, their native languages, right? So there too, I think it's striking just how many are represented and really come from.
Speak up, please.
Yeah, just thinking through what.
Sentences, just Peter right now, so you hear the first three words.
Gotcha. Okay, I'll speak up. Thank you. I can do it. I can do this. Sure. Okay, I'll project better. No, I just commented, I think this is right, this bilingual aspect of these, I mean. Most folks would have been bilingual at this point in time in terms of coming to Jerusalem, those who are able to travel. Certainly the New Testament's written in Greek, of course, and that's not the indigenous language of ancient Palestine, Judea, Galilee, and so that's interesting as well in terms of the linguistic aspect of this. I guess I want to ask the question, what language do these people hear?
Their first language,
Their first language. And why is that significant?
because it's one speaker speaking one language, but each is hearing in their own first language.
Right. I think it's actually a really striking detail. In other words, you might presume that, okay, the Spirit comes and now I'm automatically able to understand Greek, let's just say. I speak a version of ancient Persian, but suddenly Spirit comes down and I can hear Greek now, and I understand it for the first time. Or maybe I hear Aramaic and I finally understand it, though I do not speak Aramaic. That's not actually what's happening in the story. What's happening in the story is the Spirit comes down and people understand these maybe Aramaic, probably Aramaic speakers speaking in their own language. And I think that's really important feature. In other words, what the Spirit doesn't do to these people is erase their identity or erase their linguistic background. So the Spirit does not come down and say, okay, English is obviously the dominant language right now, so everybody you get to hear in English, for example. Or English speakers are going to come through and they represent a very powerful language, and now everybody will be forced to hear this in English. But actually, it's the opposite. In our own context, like we come in, we speak English, and suddenly everybody else is able to understand what we say in their languages. And what does that tell us about the role of the Spirit in the story? So I think that's actually a really important insight. Please.
Whenever we, just under normal circumstances, encounter somebody who speaks a language we know nothing about.
Yeah.
You know, the response is, we like to hear them, we don't, or understand them, but we don't.
Right.
There's a frustration.
Yeah.
We recognize that there is a breach between us that is only understandable in, I mean, there's a breach that's bridgeable sometimes only with hand signals.
Yeah, no,
You
absolutely,
know,
yeah,
and I think that. For me, this passage tells me again and again that, in the power of the Holy Spirit, we can hear each other, but it also means that there's a transformation going on within us to hear something in someone else that we weren't listening for before.
I think that's right.
And it bridges that, unfustication, as my grandfather used to say.
Yeah. No, I think it's really important. And again, it's not as if everybody has to be converted to like a Latin or Greek. I'm thinking like the powerful language of the time. That communication happens with some pretty obscure languages here. In other words, that frustration of you encounter somebody, maybe you do not know their background or their culture. The impetus is not on them to work to understand the dominant thought. The Spirit works almost the exact opposite way, right? Where it is bridging that gap to what would have been minority linguistic communities in the first century, if that makes sense. And I think that's actually kind of, I mean, we'll get into this in a little bit. That's pretty shocking overall in terms of what does the Spirit want from this early church community? Because the pressure is going to be to make something homogeneous, right? To make it a singular thing so that everybody participates in that thing. For reasons of communication, for reasons of, and let me just say, eventually in the Western church, everything gets pushed into Latin. So you can feel that in time. Like that's always the pressure. Push this stuff into the dominant language and culture. However, when you read these early stories, that's not the working of the Spirit. It's actually, it goes backwards from. And it sort of would suggest that if you come from a powerful linguistic cultural background, it's actually kind of your job to try to do that work of bridging the gap. In other words, you can't assume that folks need to understand you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. You have to do that work as well because the Spirit drives you in that direction, I think. Yeah, that's nice. Other thoughts on this passage? Please.
Just a quick other thought, it's just so interesting, there are the outsider.
Yeah.
Is the last word.
Yeah.
And this individual who's sneering. And is dismissing what's going on.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder. Are they not participating because they're already standing in judgment and they're already distancing themselves, or are they blind? Are they spiritually deaf? Can they not understand what's going on and are contemptuous of what mystifies them?
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. I think that's an interesting problem. Did Jesus not say, call no man a fool? Am I making that up?
Well, I mean, you have like you have the passages where, take out the log of your own eye before you
Right.
pick up the speck in the other. I'm trying to think of the fool.
Judge not lest you be judged.
Yes,
of
yes, of course.
It's very interesting too that this would end on that note.
Yeah. But I think gets into the tension of this. I think, it's hard to come across that sort of difference and be accepting of it. Especially if you're in Jerusalem, let's say this is a community where you would expect them to conform to you. You're coming to Jerusalem for these festivals. Jerusalem is where you're coming to. You expect them to abide by your standards, and here it's the reverse. And I think that's actually hard. I think the sneering part is actually the common reaction to this, right? Why are they speaking in their own languages when they should be speaking in our language, if you will? And seeing the Spirit work in the opposite way. I'm always kind of just struck by that feature of the story. And I have this question on my exam, because I just teach it right now, and my students always get it wrong. Not because they're bad students, but because again, the assumption is like, oh, it's one language, but everybody speaks our language. Like it's just like the Spirit forces everybody to speak one language. Because it's the reversal of like the Tower of Babel or something. And it's like, no, actually, that's not what the Spirit does. the Spirit makes it so that people in their own indigenous languages can understand. And that's always kind of an interesting feature, please.
I read a book recently called Rainbow Spirit Theology
Okay,
by Aboriginal theologians. And they really deal with what you're talking about in terms of saying now, here's our words for God, for this, for that, and had you bothered to translate to our culture, our language, we would have embraced Christianity much
Yeah.
sooner and not been alienated by what you were saying and doing. So it's a current example
yeah,
of
nice.
the problem and the reality of that problem.
Yeah,
But also with what you're saying, it's important to note in Greek that what we translate as tongues in English actually is two different Greek words. And the one that happens at Pentecost is one, but tongues and that, like Paul talks about.
Right.
Personally,
different
is a
term.
different Greek word,
Yeah.
so they're not the same word.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Really emphasizes the importance of what you're saying.
Yep, yep, that's a very good point. Yes, this has to do with a particular type of language, if you will. Yeah, so it's gonna be into the native languages these people are working in their concepts, and to see that insight already in a first century text, that you can't go out. I mean, obviously the story is in part about how do we reach out to new communities with the Christian message. And you kind of feel this warning that don't come in as a dominant culture and expect people to conform to you for the precise reasons you're talking about. Right? It's not going to land very well if you force people to erase their own identity and to force people to abandon their own language to become part of your group. I think that's a really nice insight. Please.
Yeah, that last line about, well, you know, they're drunk or they're filled with new wine.
Yeah,
So perhaps they understood, they heard what was actually being said, love your enemies.
sure.
You're drunk.
Yeah, maybe they didn't actually understand, right? They just didn't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. Okay, please.
I have the experience in India where the people there did in the villages didn't understand how Jesus came to cleanse our hearts. They didn't understand.
Fair.
And they can clean. So the ladies with their saris, the end of their sari, they used everything, wiping baby's nose, wiping the table. So they use that, my purdah. And they open it up and say, God, clean my purdah. And so the translation a lot of times is clean my purdah instead of clean my purdah.
Yeah, nice.
So a lot of times the interpretation, you have to understand the, like you said, the culture.
Yeah, that's a nice example. Yeah, I mean, and of course I do ancient translation stuff, and so even trying to get some concepts into English can be so hard from the biblical writer's perspective, because Semitic languages work differently than the European languages, and trying to make those things work is not always easy. And we have biblical translations, of course, they're trying to do that work for you, but I suppose my point is, even in English, we sometimes need that work for us, right? Yeah, that's a nice example. Good, I'm gonna move to my second story, which is Philip here. This is chapter 8 of Acts now, so the Pentecost story is chapter 2. Here in chapter 8, if you know the book of Acts, in chapter 7, Stephen is martyred. He's the first Christian martyr. And then in chapter 8, I kind of get the initial movements out of Jerusalem. So Stephen is martyred in Jerusalem. Everything is headquartered there still. And now with chapter 8, I'm moving outward. And my question here on the back is number 2. Philip's going to have this conversation with the Ethiopian eunuch. Right? And this is the second story in chapter 8. The first story is Samaria. And so what does this tell us about where the church is going? All right, so here's that text. Now those who were scattered went from place to place proclaiming the word, and Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah to them. The crowds with one accord listened eagerly to what was said by Philip, hearing and seeing the signs that he did. For unclean spirits, crying with loud shrieks, came out of many who were possessed, and many others who were paralyzed or lame were cured. So there was great joy in that city. Story 1. Here's story 2. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, get up and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is the wilderness road. So he got up and went, and now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot, he was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, go over to this chariot and join it. So Philip ran up to it and heard them reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, do you understand what you're reading? He replied, how can I unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. And if you know the rest of the story, Philip explains the story to the Ethiopian eunuch and he baptizes him, and then poof, Philip disappears. Like God plucks him up and throws him to a different place. All right. So that's the conclusion of this story of the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. So yeah, what strikes you about that story? Or how do you think about that story in terms of where the church is going or how it's proceeding?
If the Spirit will provide where there's a need, that somehow that will satisfy the need that people feel for something more.
Yeah, that's nice. And there too, I think it's important that it's the Spirit doing the work. In other words, Philip doesn't really have agency in these stories. Philip is directed by the Spirit again and again to go do these things. Right. In other words, so yeah, Philip is responding to the Spirit who is taking him and putting him in particular places. So I think that's a key observation for these stories. In other words, Philip's not going on Google Maps trying to figure out where to go next, right? Like the Spirit is driving him to certain places.
Well, the other thing is the inclusiveness of the early Christian church in the sense that Samaria they were just like Jews, except that they didn't worship in Jerusalem at the temple. They had their own Mount Tabor or whatever,
Sure.
where they worshiped. And so the Christian church reached out to these, the cousins.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then in the thing with the eunuch, the Jewish church is very, oh no, I'm sorry, you have to do these various things, you have to be circumcised and all this stuff. And if you're a eunuch, well, I'm sorry, you can't really make it here because you're damaged goods or whatever. And yet Philip goes and says, no, we're going to reach out to people who are ritually unclean or
Yeah, that's nice insight. To your point, these two opening stories are the exact populations you would not go to in the first century, or that would be problematic for different reasons, right? So the Midrash in the 2nd century CE says eating with Samaritans, if you're Jewish, is like eating with swine. It automatically makes you ritually unclean, like just even being around these people. And of course, the Good Samaritan story by Jesus and the Gospel of Luke in chapter 10 drives at this point, because you should hear the Good Samaritan story and be really upset about it. Because Jesus has suggested that Samaritans are actually decent people, which nobody in the first century would have thought. You can read all these ancient texts and the Samaritans make you sick to your stomach. And that's the first story. And then the second story, you're right, the eunuch stuff, you can't be circumcised. And so there too is a pretty striking. In other words, I think you could tell the story of the early church in all sorts of ways. Why is Luke telling these stories? I suppose is my question. Right. In other words, I think there's a lot happening. And Luke had a whole repertoire of stories to choose from as he cobbles together what he wants to tell. And Luke in chapter 8 takes, okay, here's the two stories of really, this is the true birth of the church. It begins in Jerusalem. Stephen is martyred. And now what happens to it? Where does it go next? And I think if I live in the first century, like obviously it should go to Rome first, or it should go to, again, a nice, Caesarea or powerful political places, or because I'm Luke and I'm likely a Gentile writer, I'll single out some nice Gentile, quote, non-Jewish cities, and that will make the readership very comfortable. And yet Luke does not do that. In fact, I think Luke does the exact opposite by choosing two stories that would have really upset people in the first century. If you come from a Jewish or even non-Jewish background. In other words, the audience for this, I think, would have been a little bit perplexed by the decision to do that. Please.
The question about the Ethiopian, he's a eunuch, I can see the problem there, but
Sure.
he's in a chariot. That's like hanging out in a Rolls Royce.
He's a wealthy dude, yeah.
And it's going to be the, you know, he's charged treasury for Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So he's African,
Correct.
but also there's power there. Of course, the Ethiopian Christian, was a very powerful community,
Sure.
as I understand it.
Yeah, and one of the
So-
oldest Christian communities.
So I guess there's sort of two things going on, it seems. So one is, he's, and the fact that he's a eunuch, I'm not sure that's necessarily obvious.
Sure.
So, but what is obvious is he's hanging out in a Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting, like, so the question of the outcast, I'm not, for the second story, I'm not sure I see it.
Yeah, I suppose,
Unless unless there, 'cause I don't think, obviously racism we could, but I don't think African lineage at that time was it, you know.
yeah, I
because
mean,
the word-
race, as we understand, right, no, you're right,
I think this predates what became a European
yes,
norm.
yes,
So it's a guy hanging out in his limousine.
right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is right, however, I mean, I would say Ethiopia is not obviously Judea or Galilee,
Right.
and is some distance away. Right, and certainly, I mean, I guess you would not, I think, instinctively chosen Ethiopia as your first story, as a moving out from the Jerusalem story, right? Because Samaria, you know, is the next
Yes,
province
definitely
northward,
far
right?
away.
So that's a close province, though it's very much the other province. But here we get Ethiopia, which, yes, he's wealthy, but it's not a, if you read first century sources, it's not as if it's a, you know, Egypt is way more powerful than
Oh, yeah.
Ethiopia, right? So I think that's important. And though you're absolutely right, I mean, race, as we understand, is much more of a modern European construct and so on and so forth. But certainly he would have been viewed differently in some sense, as obviously not a native indigenous Jewish individual of modern day Israel. So I mean, I think there would have been at least an observation of that fact.
Yeah.
Right, please.
And just to add to that as well, I think that, you know, the note, especially in the story, specifically mentions how he works in service of the monarchy.
Yeah.
In that space, and although it's, I mean, especially in, I can't speak specifically to Ethiopian culture.
Sure.
Like, you know, in this, you know, this early period, but I know that in Rome, especially in the Roman Empire and that entire culture, servitude is a very, so it wasn't like racism, a lot of it was like this understanding of this person, you know, you know, like, so like, even though, you know, like a slave, for instance, you know, like, they would be, you know, potentially capable of doing a lot on behalf of their master. And there's some stories, especially earlier on in the gospel, kind of mention that. But just because they were necessarily amongst the trappings of, you know, maybe like a wealth and the like, it might have been on behalf
Sure.
of that
Yeah.
community. So it's a case of like, you know, the servant might look very, very good, but they might actually be on more place. So I wonder if it's a case of like, you know, initially looks very much like they are in power, but then you go and you're like, oh, okay. You were actually, you know, the servant.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, like how wealthy was he? How much power did he actually have? Right, he was serving on somebody
Yeah.
else's behalf. Yeah,
Yeah, the societal frameworks are, yeah, I was just there to a certain extent. Way, you know, like, so.
yeah. No, I think it's a good point. Good. Quickly, let's look at the next page. There's two more stories here. One by Cornelius, about Cornelius, excuse me, and one of Lydia. And here too, I would just point out, I'm not going to read these in the service of time. But Cornelius, as you see here in chapter 10, is a centurion of the Italian cohort, as he's described. So he's a soldier on behalf of the Romans, obviously, who is in Caesarea, which is in modern day Israel, Palestine, and so it's on the coast there. Who would be there to intimidate and control the population, essentially. So that's interesting. And then Lydia here on the bottom again, in modern day Greece, essentially, is where she is stationed. And she's gonna be really important for Paul's letters as well. Again, a woman, of course, in the first century, who, is an outsider in particular ways too, I would argue. And so the framing here of these stories, here chapter 10, here chapter 16, as we think about difference, as you think about diversity in terms of the early Christian community, I mean, these are very different people. These four, so if you go from the Ethiopian eunuch to Cornelius to Lydia, I couldn't invent a more different scenario for where the church is going in terms of the Roman Empire. And that too is striking in terms of how the early church is thinking of itself and how the early church is telling the story about itself and where the church is going. And I think if I lived in the first century, I would not have instinctively chose those stories. Just knowing, I just think I've been blind to a lot of these stories. And it's striking to me that Luke really wants to focus on these individuals in the telling of the story of the early church. In ways that, in the background of Acts 2, in chapter 15 of Acts, just briefly, there's a council that takes place in Jerusalem. And it's James, the brother of Jesus. He's in charge of the Jerusalem church. Paul comes down. They have this huge conversation on what one must do to become Christian. And James and Peter and they're all Jewish Christians, of course, they grew up Jewish. And the thinking is like, well, you need to become Jewish first. You have to become circumcised. You need to keep the dietary laws. You need to keep the Torah in terms of the legal ideas put forward, because I think Jesus did that. And so therefore you must do this too. And if you're not Jewish, then you need to essentially convert to Judaism first and then become Christian. And I think that's the dominant view amongst the early Jesus community, because they're all Jewish and they're thinking that this sort of has to be the way forward. And Paul comes in and says, no, that ain't gonna work, because Paul's from Tarsus. He's from modern day Turkey. He lives in a cosmopolitan city. Tarsus is known for this. And I think Paul has good instincts that it's not going to work if you go to Gentile non-Jewish populations and force them to conform to Jewish dietary laws and circumcision. And you can really feel in that chapter some tension between what do we do next? What will the church be? Are we going to make folks conform to a Jewish identity first and then they can become followers of Jesus? Or do we respond to their own sort of cultural context, their own sense of who they are, their own identities? And like chapter 2, the answer is no, actually the church is going to go to where they are. And the church is not going to force those people to become something else that they are not. And that to me is a very striking way of framing the early church story, because I think early on, that's a minority position. Paul talks about this. Paul's not popular. Because the idea is, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, you need to conform to who we are, a Jerusalem-based, Judean, Galilean-based movement. Therefore, you need to be like us. And Paul says, I don't think that's the way it's going to work. I think we actually have to become them. And Paul very famously says, of course, when I'm in Rome, I'm a Roman. When I'm in Corinth, I'm a Corinthian. I will become whatever they are so that I can reach them. And this seems to be what eventually wins out in that early church at a crucial moment, because that Jerusalem council is at crisis point. And again, we can feel these tensions in this community. And the church saying, no, we're not actually going to try to elide difference. We're not going to try to force people to become one monolithic entity. We're going to live in the tension of these differences. And I think Acts is a good example of that in terms of how it's framing this story. So I just want to say that's one vision in the in the first century of the early church. What that means for us today is sort of up to you all. But I want to at least highlight this is one way of thinking about the Christian community that is put forward at a moment in time that I think is actually, our culture of difference, our world that is pluralistic. I promise you the first century is just like that. The Roman Empire too had these problems. And so I do want to emphasize that the early church already confronted these questions early on and proposed different ideas of addressing that at times I think were lost over history. And so trying to recapture some of that sensibility, at least, is perhaps what Acts gives us. At least that's my proposal this morning.
Perhaps Acts is the first generation followers of Jesus, whereas if you look at some of the other earlier gospels, Jesus himself was reaching out to the Samaritans,
Yep,
to the,
it's true.
to the, you know, to the head of the legions and
Yep.
stuff. So what you're pointing out here is merely the first century Jewish followers' minds opening up to what Jesus had already
That's right.
done.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they're
No,
reaching
yeah,
out and
good
doing
point.
something other than what Jesus was doing.
Right, right. I think that's a really good point. And Paul talks about this as well, where obviously his ideas are his reading of what Jesus once did. Right. So Paul's not making it up. I think you're absolutely right. Jesus seems to make an outreach to these communities in ways that would make folks kind of uncomfortable in the first century.
It's interesting to think about this in modern day terms, and you think about how our church is set up in a certain way.
Sure.
It's pretty common. And are we doing the same thing by forcing people to come to church and to act in a certain way to worship Jesus, to God, or we need to be more flexible and go out to them? I mean, it's.
That's what we're examining.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the 22nd century will be a return to the first century in many ways for Christianity. I mean, I think that's, yeah, please.
The other thought I had about what you were saying, and I appreciate the perspective, is as Christians, we expect, or I'll just speak personally, I expect other Christians to behave and believe the same way, which obviously that's never been the case, and it won't be the case now.
Right.
So it gives me a little bit of relief to take that pressure off and assume that everyone's going to be the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because certainly we're looking at Christianity different ways, and so many times in this room, we've said, well, how can they call themselves Christians and behave that way?
Yeah.
So, and they would say the same of us.
Yeah. And so, yeah, how do you, and even teaching in Georgia for 10 years where, you know, I'm not an evangelical conservative Christian. And so how do I like have that conversation with those students in ways where you don't alienate them? Even if we have profound disagreements, right? How do you find a way of keeping that community together? And I think there are some insights in these stories of profound disagreements, but not fracturing the community completely. And to me, that hardens me because I'm the same way. I mean, I'm a theology professor. I have very, you know, concrete thoughts about what theology should be. I hit my head against the wall when I talk to other Christians thinking this can't be right, but these stories give me a different kind of perspective on it. Thank you all. Yeah, I want to leave you enough time with the church. So, well, thanks for hanging out.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Really good. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna take time. Yeah, some of the colleagues of Mark Americans.
Okay, got it. Well, I was reflecting on that, conversation about the racism right now, and that's when I
Yeah, it's long. It comes in all kinds of-
Yeah, but it's not.
Yeah, there might have been some. Or for sure, it could have been like a barbarian street. So. But probably not quite the way. 15, 16 century. European research. You're right, that's right.
Read that.
Yeah.
Read that.
Thank you.
Few people realize turmoil.
Oh, I went on the floor and the whole bit. Actually, no. I've been in there. Indeed.
Right. Yes, I think it's important, you know. Our own moment is not somehow. For me, it's kind of longer view.
I think, I was thinking backing up your. Well, first of all, 89% of all. For accounting and you have to translate. I did work with computers to translate, we're using help thing, but I didn't have. But I think if you understand
Founded it. He did it because he was sent to Guatemala to sell Bibles. And soon realized that this Guatemala Spanish, and he said we have to translate.
Online. There's a place.
And so if you read some of these translations, if you understand,
Well.
read some of the lives, of the translations, you realize
All right, here we go.
that 12 to 15 years was the normal time to get in the Testament. Because it took that long to learn the culture, but they were to go as sort of anthropologists to reform and understand culture before they started translating. But a book that really illustrates this is John Johnson wrote East Town. And he was not a wisdom translator, but he was on the west half of the and he used that term for who Jesus was, what he accomplished in a way. Because the concept there was they were cannibals, and they attacked a lot. They were at war with a lot of villages, but
We live in
they
a hard
made
time
them
to grow
one
up.
village
There's
with
no
the
doubt
5
about that.
villages they were.
The guardrails are down.
Achieved that peace with that village is they actually exchanged children. And so it was giving up a child from the village and accepting a foreigner